It is 1 minute past midnight, November 15th, 1942. Below the armored deck of an American battleship, 4 men sit in a darkened room around a machine the size of a small house, gears and cams turning in red battle light. None of them can see the enemy. 8,000 yards off the port bow, a Japanese battleship called Kirishima is steering toward an American airfield she means to destroy before dawn. She is a veteran of Pearl Harbor and Midway. Her lookouts are using the finest night optics in the world. They see nothing. In the next 7 minutes, she will be hit again and again. She will lose her bridge, her steering, her engines, and hundreds of her men. She will never know who killed her, because the man who did it is 54 years old, wears wire-rimmed glasses, and once won 5 Olympic gold medals for shooting before some of his own sailors were born. He is not looking at the enemy with his eyes. He is looking at a glowing green screen. This is the story of 7 minutes that ended one era of naval warfare and began another, and of the quiet man the United States Navy nearly forgot. There is a moment in November of 1942 when the war in the Pacific can still go either way. A single airstrip on a single island, a few thousand exhausted Marines, a handful of battered American warships. That is what stands between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the collapse of an entire Allied strategy. The island is Guadalcanal. The airstrip is called Henderson Field. For 3 months, 2 empires have been bleeding into the water around it. The Marines came ashore on August 7th. They expected a fight. What they got was a campaign nobody on either side knew how to end. Tropical disease, constant night attacks, supply ships hunted by submarines, the Japanese pouring reinforcements down a chain of islands the Americans started calling the slot, the Americans holding a thin perimeter just long enough for engineers to finish patching together a runway in the mud. That runway is the prize. From Henderson Field, American dive bombers can reach Japanese transports off the coast. American fighters can drive Japanese aircraft out of the sky. Without Henderson, the Marines die. Without Henderson, Guadalcanal falls. And without Guadalcanal, the entire American plan for fighting a war across an ocean comes apart. The island itself offers no comfort to either side. The heat sits on the men like a wet blanket from dawn until well past midnight. Rain falls in walls, turning the paths between the palms into rivers of red mud. Malaria and dysentery empty out foxholes faster than enemy shells do. At night, Japanese bombers the Marines call washing machine Charlie drone overhead just to keep exhausted men awake, and offshore, unseen submarines wait for anything that moves. Every man on that beach, American and Japanese alike, has learned that daylight belongs to the side with airplanes, and darkness belongs to whoever controls the water. The Japanese understand this, so they keep coming. Cruisers and destroyers slipping down the slot after dark, shelling the airfield, landing troops. The Americans call these runs the Tokyo Express, and so far the United States Navy has very little answer for them, because at night, the Pacific still belongs to Japan. For 20 years, the Imperial Navy has trained for darkness. Its optics are among the finest in the world. Its lookouts can find a silhouette by starlight. Its Type 93 torpedo runs cleaner, farther, and faster than anything the Allies have. Its doctrine says, the night is where a smaller fleet beats a larger one. In August, off an island called Savo, 4 Allied cruisers are sunk in barely half an hour by a Japanese force that arrives unseen and vanishes before the survivors understand what has happened. American ships had radar that night. Their crews did not trust it. They were still searching with their own eyes when the first shells landed. In October, off Cape Esperance, the Americans manage a rough win using radar, and even that turns into a confused brawl in which one of their own destroyers is hit by friendly fire and lost. The lesson repeats itself every time. A ship can carry radar, but if the men aboard her do not believe in it, it cannot save them. Then comes the night of November 12th. 2 American rear admirals, Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, lead a force of cruisers and destroyers into the dark waters off Guadalcanal to stop a Japanese battleship from shelling Henderson Field. What follows is not so much a battle as a knife fight in a closet. The Japanese have a battleship. The Americans do not. The two fleets close to under 3,000 yards. Searchlights stab through the blackness. Ships fire at whoever they can see, and sometimes at whoever they cannot. By morning, the Japanese battleship Hiei is crippled, left to be finished off by aircraft the following day. By morning, both Callahan and Scott are dead, the only two American flag officers killed in surface combat in the entire Pacific War. They die within minutes of each other, on different ships, in the same patch of water. The cruiser Atlanta, with Scott aboard, takes 19 shell hits and a torpedo. 2 cruisers go down, 4 destroyers go down. The light cruiser Juno, wounded but still afloat, is torpedoed hours later by a Japanese submarine and lost with nearly her entire crew, including 5 brothers from the same Iowa family who had insisted on serving together aboard her. More than 700 American sailors are dead in a single night, and the survivors still bobbing in the oil slicks off Guadalcanal have no way of knowing that the Japanese are already coming back tomorrow night with another battleship. Word of the disaster reaches Halsey's headquarters in pieces, garbled and incomplete, the way bad news always travels from a battle fought in total darkness. What is clear by the following afternoon is simple enough. The screen that was supposed to protect Henderson Field has been gutted in a single engagement, and the Japanese have lost nothing that will keep them from trying again before dawn. Her name is Kirishima. She has been at Pearl Harbor, in the Indian Ocean, at Midway, at Santa Cruz. Around her will sail 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers under Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo. Their orders are simple. Tear Henderson Field apart with naval gunfire. Land reinforcements before dawn. End the campaign. The man who has to stop them is Vice Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific. He is 60 years old and he has almost nothing left. His cruiser force is shattered. His destroyer squadrons are scattered and thin. He has exactly 1 carrier in the area, the wounded USS Enterprise, still patching damage from earlier fighting. Enterprise has 2 battleships assigned to escort her against air attack, Washington and South Dakota. Doctrine says you do not strip a carrier of her battleship escort. Doctrine says you do not send fast battleships into a night action in confined, torpedo-infested waters. Doctrine says you wait for daylight, when carrier aircraft can do the killing. Halsey reads the reports. He studies the chart. He sees what is coming down the slot, and he sets doctrine aside. He orders Washington and South Dakota detached from Enterprise and sent north, into the dark, with 4 destroyers, Walkie, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. Task Force 64, 6 American ships against a Japanese force of 14. If Halsey is wrong, Enterprise is left exposed. If Halsey is wrong, his battleships sail into a torpedo trap in waters they barely know. If Halsey is wrong, Henderson Field falls anyway, and the war in the Pacific shifts a year, maybe 2, in Japan's favor. Whether Halsey is right depends entirely on the man he has just sent into the dark. His name is Willis Augustus Lee. He is 54 years old, a small man with thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a quiet voice that sounds more like a school teacher than a warrior. At staff meetings, he says little. While other officers make speeches, he writes equations in the margins of his notes. He is also the finest marksman the United States Navy has ever produced. At the 1920 Antwerp Olympics, he wins 7 medals in the shooting events, 5 of them gold. He is the most decorated athlete at those games, a mark no American shooter matches for decades afterward. What Lee learns at Antwerp is not how to fire a rifle. He already knows that. What he learns is something deeper. At long range, hitting a target is a problem of physics, not courage. Wind, temperature, the slow drift of a bullet across 1,000 yards. Small errors compound. Precision is everything. Feeling is nothing. Most officers around him still fight ships by feel. Lee begins thinking about how to fight them by mathematics. In the years between the wars, while other men chase glamorous commands, he buries himself in gunnery and fire control, reading everything the British send back about a new technology called radar, radio waves bouncing off a target and returning as an echo, pure numbers marking range and bearing. Exactly the kind of clean data a rifleman has been waiting his whole life to use. By 1940, Lee has toured the laboratories, read the reports, talked to the engineers. Men who serve under him will later say that Ching Lee, a nickname earned back at the Naval Academy for his interest in East Asian history, understands radar better than the men operating it. In August of 1942, he is given command of Battleship Division 6, built around the new fast battleships Washington and South Dakota. He makes Washington his flagship, and then he does something almost no other American admiral is willing to do. He rebuilds the way his ship fights around the radar. In the old doctrine, radar is a backup, checked only after the enemy is sighted by eye. Lee cuts that habit out entirely. His surface search radar feeds the plotting room directly. His fire control radar feeds the gun directors directly. A mechanical computer called the Mark 8 Rangekeeper, the size of a small room, solves the firing problem continuously while the ship maneuvers and the target moves and the wind shifts, all without a single man needing to see the enemy with his own eyes. Lee drills his crews on this relentlessly, in fog, in rain, at night, with lookouts blindfolded, firing at targets they are never shown. In a Navy whose senior officers grew up trusting their own eyes over any dial or screen, this borders on heresy. Lee does not argue with them. He simply keeps training. The hardest part is never the machinery. It is trust. Captain Glenn Davis, commanding officer of USS Washington, is a quiet, methodical man who reads manuals in his off hours. He listens to Lee. He drills the procedures. And in his own way, he decides to believe. By the time Halsey's order arrives, ordering Task Force 64 north into the dark to stop Kondo, Washington's crew has learned something no other American battleship crew has learned: how to fight blind and trust the numbers instead of their eyes. None of them yet know that everything they have practiced is about to be tested in 7 minutes against a battleship that has been at sea since before most of them were born, and that the only thing standing between Henderson Field and the guns of Hiroshima is a soft-spoken marksman who has decided to fight a naval battle with mathematics, inside a Navy that still fights with its eyes. At 2300 hours on the night of November 14th, Task Force 64 rounds the western point of Guadalcanal and turns north into Iron Bottom Sound, 6 ships in single file. The 4 destroyers lead, Walkie first, then Benham, then Preston, then Gwynn. Behind them, 2,000 yards back, the bow of USS Washington cuts a slow black line through the water. 2,000 yards behind Washington, the larger silhouette of USS South Dakota. The air is warm, close to 85 degrees, thick enough to taste. There is no moon. Low cloud blots out the stars. Far to the east, heat lightning flickers over some distant storm and dies again. The water is calm, with a slight chop. The smell of the jungle drifts off Guadalcanal, wet wood and gun oil, and the old smoke of a campaign that has been burning for 3 months. Visibility is under a mile. It is perfect weather for radar. It is the worst weather in the world for a lookout. Iron Bottom Sound itself is not deep water in the way sailors usually mean it. It is 8 miles wide between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, and it is already crowded with wrecks, Japanese, Australian, American, left over from earlier battles fought in these same narrows. It is no place to maneuver a battleship. Lee has no choice. He takes Task Force 64 into the wreckage and the dark and waits for whatever is coming. At 23:35, Washington's surface search radar paints its first contacts beyond Savo Island. Multiple groups, moving south. The plotting room reports up to Lee. Lee says nothing at first. He stands in flag plot with a headset on, listening to ranges and bearings as they come down the wire. 12 ships, 14. The count keeps climbing on the screen. Kondo has split his force into groups, exactly as Lee expected. He sends one message over the short-range radio circuit to every ship in the task force. "This is Lee. We are going into a fight. Keep your heads. Stay alert. Trust your instruments." There is no speech about glory or revenge for the men lost 2 nights before. Just the handful of plain sentences he believes a crew about to fight blind actually needs to hear. Aboard Walkie, at the head of the column, Commander Thomas Fraser watches his own radar screen. Fraser is the most experienced destroyer captain in the task force, and his radar is one of the few in the formation that comes close to matching Washington's. He watches a Japanese destroyer screen come over the horizon at 12,000 yards and asks permission to fire torpedoes at long range. It is the obvious move, the reason a destroyer exists at all. Lee says no. In the dark, with ships from both sides maneuvering at 30 knots in a narrow sound, no one will be able to tell American torpedoes from Japanese ones once they are all running through the same patch of water. If Fraser fires now, Lee's own force will be dodging 2 sets of torpedoes coming from 2 directions, with no way to read which is which. "Hold fire. Guns only. Maintain station." Fraser passes the order down. He is about to fight a Japanese destroyer division at close range without the weapon his ship was built around. At 23:17, Washington's main battery fires for the first time in her career, not yet at Kirishima, but at a Japanese cruiser group sweeping south, the light cruiser Sendai and her escorts. 9 16-inch shells climb out of the muzzle flashes and arc across the water at 400 yards a second. Each one weighs as much as a small car and carries 40 pounds of high explosive. A wall of spray 900 feet high rises around Sendai. Her captain does what any sane officer would do. He turns and runs, vanishing into his own funnel smoke. Japanese voices flood American radio intercept rooms, excited, talking over each other. Nobody on the Japanese side knew American battleships were here. They know now. But Kondo, with the main body built around Kirishima and the heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, is still coming north. He has not yet been engaged. He still believes the night belongs to him, and the American destroyers ahead of Lee's battleships have already been seen. Aboard the Japanese destroyer Ayanami, the commanding officer does not need radar. His lookouts have been adjusting their eyes to the dark for hours, and he can already make out the American destroyers as darker shapes against slightly less dark water. Ayanami fires first, launching a spread of Type 93 torpedoes, oxygen-fueled, nearly wakeless, running at 48 knots, with 3 times the range of anything the Americans carry. A searchlight snaps on from her bridge wing and finds Walkie, pinning Fraser's ship in a beam of light like an actor caught alone on a stage. Every Japanese gun in sight opens fire. Walkie is hit before her own guns finish their first salvo. Shells punch through her forward structure. Her bridge takes splinters. A forward gun mount goes silent. Fires spread along her deck. Fraser turns hard and returns fire, and Walkie's guns knock out Ayanami's searchlight and batter her deckhouse, but Ayanami is not alone. 2 more Japanese destroyers and the light cruiser Nagara join the barrage. A torpedo wake passes under Walkie's stern by feet. Fraser fires all 10 of his own torpedoes simply to empty the tubes before his ship goes down, so that at least they will not go down with her. At 23:26, a shell reaches Walkie's forward magazine. Several tons of ammunition detonate at once. The front half of the ship, from the bow back through the bridge, disintegrates in a single fireball. Fraser is killed instantly. Walkie breaks in too. The bow sinks at once. The stern burns and hangs in the water for perhaps half a minute before it rolls over and slides under. Roughly 75 men go down with her. About 60 more get clear and float in their life jackets, watching the rest of the battle unfold from the water around them. 600 yards behind Walkie, aboard USS Preston, Commander Max Storms watches his lead destroyer break apart ahead of him and keeps coming anyway, because there is nothing else to do. The battleships behind him depend on the destroyer screen holding as long as it can. Preston's guns open on Ayanami and Nagara. Multiple Japanese ships answer at once. The first salvo wrecks Preston's radar antenna. The second penetrates an engine room, and every man inside is killed almost instantly by escaping steam. Preston loses power on one shaft. Then her bridge is hit. Her communications go dead. Storms is still on his feet, fighting half a ship. At 23:30, a torpedo strikes Preston amidships. Her keel breaks. Storms orders the ship abandoned and stays on the bridge helping his men over the side. He never gets off himself. Preston rolls onto her side and sinks bow first within half a minute. 117 men die with her. About 90 survive. Lieutenant Commander John Taylor, commanding Benham, watches two destroyers vanish ahead of him in the space of a few minutes and swings his rudder hard to clear the wreckage and the men in the water. The turn likely saves his ship from one torpedo. It does not save her from another. A Type 93 strikes Benham at the waterline, 30 feet back from her bow, and 60 feet of the ship simply ceases to exist. Anchor, forward gun mounts, crew spaces, all of it gone in an instant. But the torpedo hits forward of the main watertight bulkhead, and the bulkhead holds. Benham is now 60 feet shorter than she was a minute earlier, but she is still afloat, still steering, still running her engines. Not one of her crew is killed in the blast, the only piece of good news in the entire destroyer action. Taylor nurses her south at 5 knots, all the speed her wounded hull can bear. She will stay afloat through the next day until every attempt to save her fails, and her own sister ship Gwyn is finally ordered to scuttle her crew safely taken off first. Gwyn herself, last in the column, takes a hit in her after engine room. Several of her engineers are killed. One engine fails. The other holds, and Gwyn keeps moving and keeps firing. Of the 4 destroyers Halsey could scrape together for this fight, 2 are now on the bottom of the Sound, 1 is dying, and 1 is wounded. The screen, the entire reason a battleship task force brings destroyers along, no longer exists. Lee has lost more men in barely 15 minutes than the United States Navy lost in the entire Battle of Midway. On the Japanese side, Ayanami is also mortally hit, torn apart by American gunfire from Walkie and Gwyn and from the battleship's secondary batteries. She will sink before dawn. It is, on the surface, a brutal trade, and exactly the price Lee accepted when he sent his destroyers out in front. It is also the moment the battle turns, because something else is happening 2,000 yards behind Walkie's burning wreckage that Kondo does not yet understand. USS South Dakota, the second American battleship, the one meant to fight at Washington's side, is about to take herself out of the battle, and no Japanese gun will be responsible for it. South Dakota's Captain Thomas Gatch is an aggressive officer who likes to be where the action is. When the destroyer fight erupts ahead of him, he maneuvers his ship independently, swinging out of the formation to look for his own firing solution instead of holding station behind Washington. It puts South Dakota into the burning water left by Walkie and Preston, silhouetted against their fires on a moonless night. It is the wrong place to be. But the disaster that cripples South Dakota does not come from a Japanese shell. It comes from a decision made hours earlier by her own engineers. Under pressure to keep every system running for the coming fight, a repair team had wired one troublesome circuit breaker shut so it could not trip open, a shortcut against Navy procedure and against the reason that procedure exists. At 23:33, an electrical fault occurs somewhere in the ship's power grid. The breaker that should absorb it cannot, because it has been forced closed. The fault has nowhere to go, so it climbs the system, tripping the breaker above it, then the one above that. Within seconds, the main electrical distribution of a 35,000-ton battleship collapses into darkness. Radar fails, fire control fails, gun directors freeze, ammunition hoists stop, radios go silent, even emergency lighting fails in some spaces. The newest battleship in the United States Navy goes blind in the middle of a fight she has not yet finished joining. Damage control parties grope through blacked-out passageways with flashlights, trying to find what tripped and what can be reset. In daylight, at peace, it would be a difficult repair. In pitch darkness, under fire, it is close to impossible. South Dakota drifts forward on her own momentum, unable to see the enemy, unable to fire her main battery under central control, unable to reach Lee by radio. She is a battleship with no senses left, sailing directly toward Kondo's main body. As midnight approaches, partial power returns. Some radar comes back. Some directors come back. But by then, South Dakota has drifted to within 5,500 yards of the Japanese line, barely the length of a city block in battleship terms. The heavy cruiser Otago switches on a searchlight, and the beam finds her in less than a second, framed perfectly, lit from behind by the burning American destroyers and from the front by a light she cannot yet shoot out. Every Japanese ship within range opens fire. Hirošima's main battery fires at point-blank range for a battleship. Otago and Takao add their 8-inch guns. Nagara adds her 6-inch battery. A Japanese destroyer joins in with 5-inch fire. South Dakota is hit at least 27 times in about 3 minutes. Most of the hits are from the smaller calibers, 6-inch, 5-inch, 8-inch, none able to punch through her belt armor or her turret faces. Her armor does exactly what its designers intended. Everything above the armor does not fare as well. Her forward main battery director takes a direct hit, and every man inside is killed by the shock alone, the armor holding but doing nothing to soften the blow. Her radar antennas, barely restored minutes earlier, are shattered again by shell fragments. Secondary gun mounts are knocked from their pedestals. Her superstructure is torn open in a dozen places. 39 of her men are killed and 59 wounded. Sailors and gunners and lookouts caught in the open with nowhere to go. Captain Gatch himself is wounded by a shell fragment but stays alive and on his feet. Gatch orders a hard turn to starboard and breaks contact. South Dakota disappears south into the darkness, fires burning along her decks, trailing smoke like a flag. She has been in direct action with Kondo's main body for less than 5 minutes. In the chart houses of the Japanese ships, a quiet certainty settles in. They believe they have just defeated the only American battleship in the area because they have not seen a second one. They have not seen a second one because Lee has done exactly what he set out to do. Washington is 2,000 yards north, sitting in deeper shadow, her own gunfire from minutes before already lost in the general chaos of the night. Japanese radar, what little of it exists, cannot separate two large targets in the surface clutter of a crowded sound. Japanese lookouts, however skilled, are blinded by their own searchlights, their own muzzle flashes, and the fires of the burning American ships. Kondo reads the picture in front of him. One American battleship, illuminated, hit and running. A destroyer screen destroyed. He has lost Ayanami, but he believes he has broken the American force. The road to Henderson Field looks open. He believes he has already won this battle. He will go on believing it for another 19 minutes. Below Washington's armored deck, in a compartment lit only by red battle lamps, 4 men sit around the Mark 8 rangekeeper. Gears turn. Cams shift. A pointer slides across a graduated wheel, updated every 2 seconds by fresh readings from the fire control radar 60 feet above their heads. The target is the largest contact remaining in the Japanese line. Bearing steady, range 8,400 yards, speed 18 knots. The rangekeeper solves the lead. The directors raise the guns. 9 16-inch rifles and 3 turrets are now aimed at a Japanese battleship that none of the men below decks has ever seen with his own eyes. Captain Davis glances at Lee. Lee is watching the radar repeater, the bright point of light that is Kirishima, moving slowly and steadily across the screen, unaware that she is being tracked. Lee has been watching her for 20 minutes. He turns to the talker. "Give me the range and bearing of the largest target." The numbers come back. He nods once and tells Davis to stand by. It is the stroke of midnight turning November 14th into November 15th, 1942. In the next 7 minutes, the way navies fight at sea is about to change. At the order, Washington's 9 16-inch rifles fire as one. The blast lights the sea for half a mile. The shock wave rolls back across the water hard enough to empty a man's lungs if he forgets to open his mouth on deck. 24,000 pounds of steel and explosive leave the muzzles in the same instant, and the ship herself heels several feet to starboard from the recoil. 9 armor-piercing shells climb into the night sky, each one taller than a man and heavy as a small truck, each carrying 40 pounds of bursting charge behind a hardened nose. They rise miles into the air before curving down at a steep angle, the very angle that finds the thinnest armor a battleship carries, the deck plating overhead, rather than the thick belt along her sides. Flight time to target, 20 seconds. On Kirishima's bridge, her lookouts are still facing forward, watching for the approach to Henderson Field. Nobody aboard her yet understands that a second American battleship exists. They learn when the deck explodes beneath their feet. The first salvo lands on Kirishima's bridge tower and forward structure. Her rangefinder is destroyed. Her fire control wiring is severed. Her plotting room loses contact with the gun directors in the same instant. Men on the bridge are killed by the shock of the blast alone, with no fragment ever touching them. Her captain, Sanji Iwabuchi, is thrown from his feet but survives. Most of the men around him do not. He gets back up, finds his voice tube still working, and orders return fire from whichever turrets can still hear him. 30 seconds later, Washington's gun crews have reloaded, and 9 more shells are in the air. This salvo lands amidships and forward. One shell drives through the armored deck near the forward magazines, the most dangerous hit a battleship can absorb. Iwabuchi orders those magazines flooded to prevent a chain explosion that would tear his ship apart. The flooding saves Kirishima from destroying herself in an instant. It also disables her entire forward main battery, cutting off its ammunition supply completely. Another shell from the same salvo brings down her mast and her backup fire control director, crushing men beneath it as it falls. Kirishima's eyes are gone. She tries to fight anyway. Her 2 rear turrets are still mechanically able to fire, and their local gun captains can see the muzzle flashes lighting the horizon to the southwest. Without radar or usable optics, they estimate Washington's range by the brightness of her gunfire and guess roughly 10,000 yards. Washington is closer to 8,600. It is close enough in most wars to matter little. Tonight, it is the margin between a hit and a miss. Kirishima's after turrets fire a salvo of their own that passes over Washington's masts by only a couple hundred feet, close enough that a sailor on her signal bridge will remember the pressure of it on his face and the sound of something like a freight train passing overhead in the dark. Washington's third salvo lands amidships. Shells punch through her side armor and explode in both engine rooms. Boilers rupture. Steam lines burst. Men on watch there are killed almost instantly. Kirishima's speed begins to fall away. 20 knots, then 18, then 15. The fourth salvo finds her steering gear. A shell explodes near the rudder machinery, cutting the hydraulic lines that turn a battleship of her size. Kirishima's rudder jams, and she begins circling slowly to port, unable to control her own course. The fifth salvo opens her hull below the waterline on the starboard side, and she begins to list. The sixth salvo silences her remaining turrets for good. Aboard Washington, gun crews sweat in the heat of their turrets, while the plotting room calls out fresh ranges every 2 seconds, and the rangekeeper grinds through its solutions. Davis paces the bridge. Lee watches the bright point of light that is Kirishima slow, turn, and slow again. At 1 minute past midnight, she was making 18 knots. By 7 minutes past midnight, she is dead in the water. In those same 7 minutes, Washington has fired 75 rounds of 16-inch and more than 100 rounds of 5-inch. Later surveys of the wreck will suggest that somewhere between 9 and 20 of the 16-inch shells found their mark, along with dozens more of the smaller rounds, though the exact count will never be fully known. What is certain is that Kirishima can no longer move, fight, steer, or control her fires. At 7 minutes past midnight, Lee orders a ceasefire. There is no reason to spend more ammunition on a ship already finished, and there are other dangers now. Japanese destroyers have been firing torpedoes throughout the engagement, dozens of them running somewhere in the dark on courses aimed at muzzle flashes rather than any confirmed position. Lee orders hard turns, first one way and then the other, and Washington zigzags at 25 knots through waters laced with torpedoes her lookouts can barely see. Wakes pass close along both sides of the ship. None of them hit. By midnight, Washington is clear of the torpedo water. By 3 a.m, Lee orders the task force to withdraw. Henderson Field is safe for another night. Behind Task Force 64, on a darkened patch of water 7 miles northwest of Savo Island, Captain Sanji Iwabuchi is making the last decision he will ever make aboard a battleship. Japanese destroyers have come alongside Kirishima in the dark, taking off her wounded. Her fires cannot be brought under control. Her list is climbing past 15 degrees. Her forward magazines are flooded, but other compartments are flooding on their own now, faster than any pump aboard her can keep pace with. At 03:25, Iwabuchi gives the order to abandon ship. His men have done everything duty required of them. There is nothing left to gain by staying aboard a hull that can no longer fight or float much longer. Destroyers standing by in the dark take off as many of the wounded and the able-bodied as they can reach before the list grows too severe to keep boats alongside. Kirishima rolls slowly to starboard and goes down by the bow, the fires along her deck hissing out one by one as the sea closes over them. 212 men go down with her. In nearly 4,000 feet of water off the coast of the island, she had sailed north to help capture only hours before. Half a century later, an oceanographer named Robert Ballard will find her on the seabed, capsized, her turrets broken loose from their mounts, and resting in the silt beside her hull, the wounds Washington put in her still visible in the lights of a deep-water camera. For decades before that discovery, Kirishima exists only as a set of numbers in an action report, a ship that simply stopped answering and was assumed lost. The wreck, when it is finally found, confirms almost exactly what Washington's gunnery officers estimated that night by instrument alone, without ever once laying eyes on their target. USS Washington, by contrast, has not been hit once. Not a single man aboard her has been wounded. Her paint is unmarked by the battle. Down in her turrets, the gun crews who spent 7 minutes loading and firing in stifling heat now stand in sudden quiet, listening to their own ship's engines and the distant, dying flicker of fires on the horizon behind them. The only visible sign of what she has just done is that her 16-inch gun barrels are scorched black from breech to muzzle by the heat of continuous fire, and that the men who serve them are too keyed up from adrenaline to feel, yet, how tired they actually are. In the days afterward, Captain Glenn Davis writes an action report that will be read and quoted in naval war colleges for the next 80 years. Radar, he writes, has forced the officer in tactical command to base a greater part of his actions on what he is told rather than what he can see. It is a single sentence describing the end of one age of naval warfare and the beginning of another. A few days later, Lee himself writes to Halsey. The letter is not what anyone would expect from a man who has just fought and won the only one-on-one battleship duel of the Pacific War. He does not claim credit for himself, and he does not dwell on the men he lost aboard Walkie and Preston, though he knew both ships and their captains personally. Instead, he gives the credit to the radar. We realized then, he writes, and it should not be forgotten now, that our entire superiority was due almost entirely to our possession of radar. We had no advantage over the Japanese in experience, skill, training, or the performance of our personnel. It is an admiral telling his theater commander, in writing and for the permanent record, that his crew was not braver or better trained than the enemy they had just destroyed, and that the only real difference between victory in Iron Bottom Sound and the fate of Callahan and Scott 2 nights earlier was a piece of electronic equipment that most of the Navy's senior officers still did not fully trust, and that Lee himself had spent a decade convincing a handful of stubborn crews to believe in, before anyone in Washington ordered them to. Lee never turns the moment into a speech. He gives no interviews about Guadalcanal, appears in no newsreels, writes no memoir. He is awarded the Navy Cross for the action, promoted to Vice Admiral the following year, and sent on to the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, where he commands every fast battleship in the Pacific Fleet for the remainder of the war, working himself past the point of exhaustion doing it. Sanji Iwabuchi survives the sinking of Kirishima, pulled from the water or taken off by one of the destroyers standing by in the dark. The Japanese Navy promotes him to Rear Admiral and sends him to the Philippines to command naval forces defending Manila. In February of 1945, with General Yamashita's army already withdrawing from the city, Iwabuchi refuses to abandon it and instead fights room by room with the naval troops and Marines under his command. The month-long battle that follows leaves much of Manila in ruins and kills well over 100,000 Filipino civilians, one of the worst atrocities of the entire Pacific War. Iwabuchi dies in the wreckage of the city he refused to give up, the exact circumstances of his death lost in the chaos of the fighting. The same officer who survived Lee's 9 hits in Iron Bottom Sound, who lived through the loss of his ship and 212 of his own men, closes out his war 2.5 years later in one of its darkest chapters, a straight and bitter line running from a battleship's plotting room to the streets of a burning city. On August 25, 1945, 10 days after Japan signs its surrender, Vice Admiral Willis Augustus Lee is being ferried by launch across Casco Bay off Portland, Maine, on his way out to his flagship, the old training battleship USS Wyoming. He is 57 years old. He has not had a full week of rest in 3 years, having spent the war moving from one fast battleship task force to the next, from Guadalcanal to the Marianas to Okinawa, always at sea, rarely home. His heart gives out before the launch reaches the ship, and he dies in the boat, only days after the fighting he spent his whole career preparing for has finally, officially, ended. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery under a plain white marble headstone in a long row of identical plain white markers, indistinguishable at a glance from the thousands of other officers and enlisted men resting around him. The inscription gives his name, his rank, and the dates of his birth and death. It notes his Olympic medals. It says nothing about Guadalcanal. It says nothing about Kirishima. It says nothing about radar or about the 7 minutes that proved, once and for all, that a war at sea could be won by men who never saw their enemy at all. USS Washington serves through the rest of the war, and none of it is quiet. She screens the fast carriers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where American aircraft break the back of Japanese naval aviation for good. She adds her guns to the bombardments of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, supporting Marines fighting through terrain as brutal in its own way as the jungles of Guadalcanal had been 3 years earlier. She is present in Tokyo Bay for the formal Japanese surrender in September of 1945, one of hundreds of Allied ships anchored in the same harbor Kirishima's crew had once sailed from with such confidence. Afterward, she turns to a gentler duty, ferrying tired American soldiers home across the Atlantic from a Europe finally at peace. The Navy places her in reserve in 1947, and she sits largely forgotten for 13 years, her guns silent, her crew long since scattered back into civilian life. In 1961, she is finally sold for scrap and towed to a yard near New York, where her armor plate is cut apart section by section, and her 16-inch barrels, the same 9 guns that fired 75 rounds in 7 minutes on a single night in 1942, are burned through with cutting torches until nothing recognizable remains of them. By the end of that year, the ship that destroyed a Japanese battleship in 7 minutes without taking a single hit in return no longer exists as a ship, reduced to scrap steel sold by the ton. But the idea she was built to prove is still at sea, on the bridge of every modern warship in the world. The Combat Information Center, the compartment where radar and sonar and every other sensor a ship carries are gathered into a single tactical picture for the commander to read, was created by Navy planners in the months after Guadalcanal, once they finally understood what Lee had already built aboard Washington by instinct and stubbornness alone. Where Lee had improvised a handful of connections between radar sets, a mechanical range keeper, and a plotting room lit by battle lamps, the Navy now formalizes that same idea into a standard compartment aboard every major warship. A single space where every sensor a ship carries feeds into one shared picture instead of a dozen separate ones scattered across the hull. It is now standard equipment on every warship larger than a patrol boat, and it traces a direct line back through the plotting room of a single battleship on a single night in November of 1942, when a handful of men chose to trust a green glass screen over the darkness outside their portholes. A quiet man in wire-rimmed glasses, who spent his career refusing to take credit for the thing he built, changed the way navies fight at sea forever. He is buried under a stone that does not say so, in a cemetery full of other men who also never asked to be remembered for what they did. By every account of the men who knew him, he would have preferred it exactly that way.